There is something insidious about the human tendency to hold on to pain. It doesn't always come from a place of deliberate desire, nor does it always feel like an active choice. Yet, time and time again, many of us find ourselves locked in cycles of suffering, unable to move forward, even when logic tells us that we should have left the pain behind long ago. We get caught in patterns, in stories, in emotions that seem impossible to escape. But why? Why is it so difficult to let go of suffering, even when it feels like the last thing we want? Before I reveal the answer to this question, I ask you to perform 3 simple things. Hit that like button and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers, and comment one thing that you are grateful for today. Thank you for your support, and let's get back to the video. Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, proposed a chilling answer to this question. He suggested that suffering is not always an unfortunate accident or a random flaw in our psyche. Instead, it is often rooted deep within our unconscious mind, a place where forgotten memories, unresolved emotions, and repressed desires live. Freud's theories challenge us to consider a darker truth. The unconscious mind doesn't just carry our pain, it often needs it. Freud's work revolves around the complex interplay between the conscious and unconscious mind. He argued that much of human behavior is shaped by forces outside of our awareness. The pain we carry, he said, isn't just the result of external trauma. It's also the result of forces within the psyche that we don't fully understand. These forces don't act with logic or reason, but instead they are driven by unconscious drives and unresolved conflicts. To understand why we can't let go of suffering, we need to look at Freud's theory of the unconscious mind. The unconscious, according to Freud, is not just a passive storage unit for forgotten memories. It is an active force in our lives, controlling our desires, thoughts, and actions in ways we are not always aware of. The mind doesn't just repress pain and traumatic memories for no reason. It does so in a way that often perpetuates the cycle of suffering. This brings us to one of Freud's most unsettling concepts, the death drive. For years, Freud had built his understanding of human behavior around the concept of the pleasure principle, the idea that human beings are driven by the need to seek pleasure and avoid pain. It was an elegant, almost comforting idea. If we could just avoid pain and pursue pleasure, life would be smooth, right? But Freud's later work complicates this theory. He noticed that something was missing from his earlier explanations. Despite the mind's supposed preference for pleasure, he observed behaviors that made no sense when viewed through the lens of the pleasure principle. Why, for example, would people repeatedly sabotage their own happiness? Why do we return to painful relationships or revisit traumatic memories, as if drawn to the very things that hurt us? Why, when healing seems possible, do we seem to relapse into old suffering? It was this paradox that led Freud to propose a more troubling theory, the death drive. Freud argued that there is something in the human psyche that is not only indifferent to pleasure, but actively seeks the dissolution of life itself. This force pushes us toward inertia, regression, and a return to an inorganic state, the state of nothingness. It manifests not as a conscious desire to destroy, but as an unconscious compulsion to repeat painful experiences, to return to the safety of what we know, even if that safety is suffering. At first glance, this might sound absurd. After all, no one consciously seeks to destroy themselves. But as Freud suggested, these destructive behaviors are not about conscious intent. They are a result of unconscious forces that operate beneath the surface of our awareness. These forces are not the result of rational thought. They are driven by a deeper need to return to a state of non-existence, to disintegrate what is alive within us. This is the death drive, a silent, insistent force that undermines our ability to thrive, to move forward, and to heal. Take a moment to reflect. Have you ever found yourself on the verge of success, only to self-sabotage? Have you ever stayed in a relationship that constantly brings you pain, unable to break free? Or perhaps you found yourself repeating the same destructive patterns, unable to change, even though you deeply desire to. This is the power of the death drive, the way it weaves itself into the unconscious and forces us to repeat our suffering. But it's not just about repeating the past. The repetition of pain has its own logic. Freud's theory of repetition compulsion explains that our unconscious minds compel us to repeat unresolved conflicts in an effort to master them. We return to the trauma, the pain, the same destructive patterns, as though we are trying to resolve them, to make them understandable. We might consciously wish to move past these wounds, but unconsciously, the psyche feels driven to revisit them over and over again, in the hopes of gaining control, of rewriting the narrative. But no matter how many times we play the scene, the outcome remains the same: pain. It's as if our minds believe that only by reliving the pain can we finally understand it, control it, or perhaps even put it to rest. Yet this never happens. Instead, the cycle repeats itself, unconsciously, inexorably. And the more we try to resist it, the more it demands our attention, pulling us back to the very pain we long to escape. This concept challenges our entire view of healing. We think that healing comes from moving forward, from letting go, from getting over it. But Freud's work suggests that healing doesn't come from avoidance. It comes from understanding and confronting the unconscious forces that drive our suffering. This means we have to confront the very thing that we've been trying to escape, the unconscious desire for suffering that resides within us. As uncomfortable as this may sound, Freud's ideas offer us something crucial: awareness. He doesn't promise a world free of suffering. Instead, he points to the fact that suffering is not random. It is driven by forces that we may not fully understand, but that we can begin to make sense of. And by making these unconscious forces conscious, by acknowledging the death drive, the repetition compulsion, and the hidden desires that bind us to our pain, we begin to open the door to freedom. But there's a catch. Understanding why we suffer doesn't necessarily bring immediate relief. In fact, confronting the unconscious forces behind our pain can be incredibly difficult. The death drive doesn't disappear just because we acknowledge it. And the patterns we've spent a lifetime repeating won't vanish overnight. But awareness is the first step to breaking free. It's the key to transforming unconscious suffering into conscious understanding. To understand why suffering is so difficult to release, we must confront the paradox at the core of the human psyche. Freud's work teaches us that suffering is not merely something that happens to us. It is something that is woven into the very structure of the mind. It is not simply an external force we react to. It is an internal dynamic that shapes how we experience the world. Freud's idea of the pleasure principle suggested that the mind is fundamentally driven by the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. On the surface, this seems logical. Human beings seek comfort, relief, and happiness. But when we look deeper, Freud began to question this simple notion. What if there are forces at play that counteract this drive for pleasure? What if, at a fundamental level, the mind is not just trying to avoid pain, but is actually repeating it, almost compulsively? Freud's theory of repetition compulsion explains how we find ourselves replaying our suffering. This is not a conscious decision. It's not as if we wake up one day and choose to repeat the same painful experiences. Instead, it's as though something in the mind compels us to revisit unresolved pain, as if the unconscious believes that somehow, through repetition, it can regain control over the trauma. But the repetition doesn't heal. It perpetuates the cycle. Consider how many times you've returned to situations or relationships that you know will hurt you. How many times have you failed to break free from a pattern of behavior, even when you desperately want to? Freud argued that this isn't just poor decision-making. It's the mind's unconscious need to relive pain until it can find a way to resolve it. But the resolution never comes because the unconscious doesn't know how to process the trauma. It only knows how to repeat it. Think of the person who constantly sabotages their relationships, even though they crave love and connection. Or the individual who self-destructs just when they are on the verge of success. These behaviors aren't about a conscious desire for pain. They are the manifestation of unconscious drives, forces that are much stronger than conscious will. The mind is trying to resolve the unresolved, but it only leads to more suffering. This is the essence of Freud's death drive, a force within us that seeks to return to a state of non-existence, a state of no tension, no conflict, even if that means self-destruction. It is not a desire for actual death, but a psychological drive toward inertia, toward a cessation of struggle. The mind seeks relief, but it often seeks it through self-sabotage, through behaviors that perpetuate suffering. Here's where it gets truly unsettling. We are not always aware of this drive. The death drive is not an obvious force. It doesn't announce itself in a way we can easily recognize. The mind doesn't simply forget the trauma. It becomes more intricately bound to it, unable to release it. These suppressed emotions, experiences, and memories shape our behaviors in ways we can't always explain. We return to unhealthy relationships, make self-destructive choices, or engage in behaviors that only bring us more suffering. Freud observed this in his patients, where the act of repression led to a buildup of psychological energy that would find its way out in distorted forms, through anxiety, physical symptoms, or compulsive behaviors. Freud's theory of the return of the repressed is essential here. What we suppress doesn't disappear. It returns, often in unexpected ways. It resurfaces as compulsive behaviors, unexplainable anxieties, or recurring emotional reactions that feel out of our control. Have you ever experienced a moment when something seemingly trivial triggered a powerful emotional response? Something you didn't even understand? That's repression at work. The emotion was buried, but it never truly disappeared. It merely waited until the right moment to rise to the surface again. But repression and the return of the repressed are not just about the mind's defense mechanisms. They are also a reflection of the deeper conflict within the psyche. The unconscious mind does not just hold repressed pain. It actively drives us toward it. This is where Freud's theory of the death drive becomes so unsettling. If the pleasure principle is the force that seeks pleasure, the death drive seeks something far darker, the return to nothingness, to a state of inertia and dissolution. The death drive operates silently, influencing us in ways we don't fully understand. It's not a conscious desire for death or self-destruction. It's the mind's unconscious tendency to push itself toward destruction as a way of escaping the tension of life, the conflict, and the struggle for meaning. It's a pull toward the inorganic, to the void that exists beyond life. This force doesn't desire to grow, to evolve, or to become whole. It desires dissolution, the cessation of internal conflict. Freud saw this drive manifest in behaviors that defied the logic of survival. People would choose pain, destruction, or failure even when success or healing was within reach. The death drive pulls us toward this collapse, this dissolution of the self, because it offers an escape from the tension, from the internal conflict that life demands. In essence, the death drive is the desire to escape the very essence of life itself, to return to the void before existence, before suffering. It is this unconscious desire to return to this state of nothingness that makes suffering so difficult to escape. We don't just cling to pain because it's familiar. We cling to it because, on a deep level, the unconscious believes that pain is a solution. Pain offers a resolution to the tension of living. It promises relief, a cessation of conflict. And while this may sound absurd to the conscious mind, the unconscious works in strange, paradoxical ways. It doesn't follow logic. It follows impulses, drives, and patterns that we often don't understand. Take a moment to consider this. How many times have you felt stuck in a cycle of pain, knowing you need to break free, but feeling as though something pulls you back into it? It's not because you want to suffer. It's because the mind is caught in a deeply ingrained pattern of repetition and self-sabotage. The unconscious mind finds comfort in the chaos, in the pain, because it does not know how to exist without it. The cycle of suffering becomes an unconscious comfort zone, a place where the psyche feels it can survive. This isn't to say that people choose pain. No one consciously wants to suffer, but the unconscious mind operates on a different level of understanding. It does not choose life as we consciously understand it. It chooses inertia, dissolution, and the return to the pre-life state. The reality of the death drive is that it pushes us toward behaviors that ultimately undermine our survival, our well-being, and our happiness. It is this tension, this battle between the life drive, eros, and the death drive, thanatos, that defines much of our suffering. The life drive is the force that propels us toward growth, creativity, and connection, while the death drive seeks to undermine all of this, pushing us back toward the safety of non-existence. We are, in many ways, caught between these two forces, perpetually torn between growth and dissolution. At the core of this struggle is the unconscious. The unconscious does not operate on the same logic as the conscious mind. It is not concerned with survival or pleasure in the same way. It is driven by an irrational need for balance, for resolution, even if that resolution is self-destructive. The pain we experience, the suffering we cannot let go of, is not simply a side effect of life. It is a manifestation of these unconscious forces, forces that we are only beginning to understand. The complexities of the unconscious mind don't end with the death drive. There is a deeper mechanism at work within us, one that keeps us bound to our suffering. Freud's ideas about repetition compulsion offer a way of understanding why we find ourselves revisiting the same painful experiences, even when we consciously want to escape them. The compulsion to repeat isn't just about reliving the past, it's about trying to master the past, to gain control over pain and trauma that we have not processed. In his work, Freud observed that many of his patients seemed to act out their unresolved conflicts, returning to the same situations over and over again, as though hoping that this time the outcome would be different. It was as if the unconscious mind was trying to reenact the original trauma, but in a controlled, managed way. It wanted to find a resolution, a way to rewrite the story, to somehow resolve the feelings of helplessness or victimhood that had marked the initial experience. But, as Freud discovered, this cycle never leads to resolution. It only reinforces the pain. Consider how often people find themselves in relationships that echo the same dynamics as their childhood, or how they repeatedly sabotage themselves at the moment of success. They may consciously know better, but on an unconscious level, they are reenacting the same painful patterns. They seek mastery over the unresolved conflict, but instead, they're trapped in it. This repetition isn't random. It's a symptom of the unconscious mind's attempt to reprocess, to attempt to heal the wound that was never fully addressed. But the wound remains open, always fresh, because the unconscious can't simply move forward. It must repeat, searching for a resolution that will never come through repetition alone. This is where the paradox lies. The unconscious mind is not only holding on to suffering, it is actively trying to resolve it through compulsion. It is as if the psyche is compelled to act out the trauma over and over again, believing that somehow, in doing so, it will find closure. But the more it repeats, the more the suffering intensifies, as the pattern becomes stronger, deeper, and harder to break. In these moments of repetition, Freud believed that the mind is not just trapped in the past, it is actively creating the past anew, as if to rewrite history, to gain a sense of control over something that was once uncontrollable. But in doing so, the cycle becomes self-reinforcing. The more we try to resolve the pain through repetition, the more it binds us to that same unresolved suffering. The reason why we cannot simply let go of suffering is that, on some level, the unconscious needs it to resolve what has been left undone. The unconscious demands attention to the unresolved, even when we consciously wish to move on. It needs to replay the scene, to look for a new conclusion, and this search for closure becomes its own addiction. Each time the cycle repeats, it creates the illusion of progress, as though this time the pain might be fully understood or fixed. But the cycle never ends. It only deepens. It is also here that we must examine guilt, another central theme in Freud's work. Guilt, like suffering, is often not fully recognized in the conscious mind, yet it plays a profound role in shaping our behaviors and emotional states. Freud saw guilt as a powerful emotional force that could, in some cases, lock individuals in cycles of self-punishment. This self-punishment is not always a conscious choice, but rather a compulsive drive created by the unconscious. The psyche, feeling unworthy or imperfect, might turn against itself, inflicting suffering as a way of dealing with perceived inadequacy or the need for atonement. Guilt works hand in hand with the repetition compulsion. When guilt is repressed, it forces the mind to seek ways to atone for its perceived wrongs, often in irrational or self-destructive ways. The mind then creates cycles of suffering that seem to have no end. Freud observed this in many of his patients, how they would create or find situations where they could pay for their mistakes, even if those mistakes were not clearly defined or were buried in their unconscious. This perpetual state of self-punishment keeps them trapped in their own suffering, unable to break free, because guilt keeps the cycle going. And here we come to an uncomfortable truth. Some part of us, unconsciously, may feel that we deserve the suffering we experience. It's as if the mind, in its attempt to resolve the internal tension, decides that suffering is the only way to atone, to make things right. This is why breaking the cycle is so incredibly difficult. To release suffering means questioning the internal script that the mind has written, a script that says, I must suffer to atone for my wrongs, to make myself worthy, to resolve what I cannot remember. This is not a simple matter of willpower. You cannot just decide to stop suffering. The unconscious mind works on a different level. It does not respond to logic or reason in the way the conscious mind does. The unconscious operates on its own terms, through symbolism, repetition, and compulsion. Until we bring awareness to these hidden forces, they will continue to pull the strings, guiding us back to the very suffering we wish to escape. And this is where Freud's psychoanalysis offers a path forward, but not an easy one. It is not a quick fix, nor a magical solution. Psychoanalysis involves bringing the unconscious into the light of awareness, facing the forces that drive us towards suffering, and slowly untangling the patterns that bind us to it. It requires the courage to confront the hidden wounds that the mind has been repressing for so long, to face the painful truth that, in some ways, we are complicit in our own suffering. But there is hope in this confrontation. For only when we recognize the unconscious forces at play can we begin to reclaim our lives, to break free from the cycles that have held us captive. The path to healing is not a smooth, linear journey, but a process of awakening, of waking up to the parts of ourselves that have been buried, of recognizing the scripts that have guided our behavior without our knowledge. At this point, we must come face to face with the undeniable truth of Freud's work. We are often the architects of our own suffering. The unconscious mind, with its drive for repetition and its complex defense mechanisms, binds us to pain in ways that can be hard to comprehend. But there is a deeper layer to this suffering, one that Freud highlighted in his most unsettling ideas. The unconscious does not simply carry pain. It creates it, perpetuates it, and guides us back to it time and again. And herein lies the psychological horror of it all. We are not only victims of our suffering, but we are also its creators. This is not to say that we consciously choose to suffer. No one desires pain. But on a deeper unconscious level, we are driven by forces that keep us locked in cycles of repetition. It's almost as if, somewhere deep inside, we believe that we are meant to suffer, that our worth is tied to the amount of pain we endure. Freud believed that this was, in many ways, a reflection of the death drive, a silent, insistent force that pushes the psyche toward destruction and dissolution, often through the very mechanisms that we believe should be helping us. The mind is not just a passive receiver of suffering, it is an active participant in the creation of that suffering. The unconscious mind, through the process of repression, returns our pain to us over and over again in ways we cannot control. The death drive doesn't just desire escape from tension. It desires to escape life itself, to return to the primal state of non-existence, and it is this drive that keeps us trapped, returning to our old wounds, reliving past traumas, and sabotaging our own efforts to heal. We must ask ourselves, what does suffering do for us? Why is it so difficult to release it? Freud's theories give us an uncomfortable answer. Suffering, at some level, becomes our identity. It becomes a familiar companion, a part of who we are. The unconscious mind links suffering to a sense of self, to the image we hold of ourselves and our place in the world. For many, pain becomes the framework through which they interpret their lives. In a strange way, suffering provides certainty. It is predictable, known, and at least, in its familiarity, it offers some comfort, even if that comfort is painful. It is when we try to break free of that familiar pain that we confront the terror of the unknown. The unconscious mind fears the loss of the identity that suffering creates. This is not to say that the suffering itself is comforting, but rather, the identity built around it becomes strangely familiar. For those who have experienced chronic pain, trauma, or emotional abuse, breaking free of suffering feels like the loss of a piece of themselves. Who would they be without the pain? What happens when the very thing that defined their existence, whether consciously or unconsciously, is removed? Freud's work suggests that healing, in this context, doesn't just mean stopping the pain. It means reconstructing the self. It means rethinking who we are without the lens of suffering, without the narrative that we are defined by our past wounds. It is through self-awareness that we begin to free ourselves from the unconscious drives that bind us to repetitive pain. And this process is not simple or quick. It involves confronting the parts of ourselves that we have hidden, the parts that may have been created through years of repression, the parts that continue to create and recreate suffering. But this is the paradox of healing. To truly break free from suffering, we must first acknowledge it, face it, and understand why it continues to cycle in our lives. We must explore the unconscious scripts that the mind has written, scripts that repeat in the background, influencing our behaviors, relationships, and decisions without our conscious awareness. Healing requires facing the darkness, not running from it. Freud did not promise salvation. He did not say that we could easily escape pain. In fact, he argued that pain and suffering are inseparable from the human experience. But what he did offer was something far more powerful than simple comfort: understanding. He suggested that only by bringing the unconscious into the light, by making our suffering visible, can we begin to transform it. This is where psychoanalysis plays its part. By becoming aware of the unconscious forces that drive us, we begin to gain control over them. The cycle of suffering loses its power when we recognize it, understand its origins, and most importantly, acknowledge that it is not who we are. It is simply something that has been shaping us. Once we make the unconscious conscious, it no longer dictates our behavior with the same force. The power of suffering lies in its hiddenness, and once that hiddenness is exposed, its grip begins to loosen. Yet, even once we become aware of the forces at play, the journey to freedom is not quick. It requires an ongoing commitment to awareness and integration. Healing is not about eliminating suffering altogether. It is about understanding it, processing it, and over time, learning to live beyond it. The pain does not define us, but it is a part of us. It becomes a story, not an identity. Once we accept this truth, we can begin to write a new chapter. But what happens when we finally stop repeating the cycle? What does life look like once we release the patterns that have defined us for so long? The absence of suffering can be just as frightening as suffering itself. The mind, conditioned by years of pain, can find the emptiness that comes with healing to be unsettling, even threatening. Who am I without my suffering? That question often echoes through the minds of those who are on the path to healing. The journey, then, is not just about freeing oneself from pain, but also about confronting the vacuum that pain has occupied for so long. This is where true liberation begins, not in the absence of suffering, but in the conscious transformation of it. When we face our pain, when we make it visible, We stop being at the mercy of it. We stop being unconscious participants in our own suffering. We become the conscious authors of our own story, and in doing so, we reclaim control. What is not understood repeats itself, as Freud famously said. But what is understood can be transformed. And in that transformation, we begin to rewrite the script that the unconscious has been playing out for us all along. It is not easy work, but it is necessary work. The path to freedom lies not in avoiding suffering, but in confronting it with full awareness. Now, my beautiful viewer, if this message has sparked something in you, feel free to like and subscribe and comment. I am successful if you have reached this far into the video. Thank you and hope to see you in the next video. Salute.